Welcome to a new episode of Cybersecurity Under Pressure. Real attacks, real lessons. Today is Wednesday, May 13th, 2026. And for those of you joining us, while the title says episode, what we actually do here is a deep dive.
Yeah, a massive, frankly exhausting deep dive.
Exactly. We take a giant stack of sources.
Yeah.
So today it's white papers from the Datacom Industry Association, the EN 50159 standards, the latest 3GPP specs, and we extract the absolute most critical, often terrifying nuggets of knowledge for you.
Terrifying is definitely the right word for today's topic.
Right, because our mission today is to pull you into the incredibly high-stakes, deeply misunderstood world of operational technology security. Specifically, we're looking at the nightmare of securing high-speed railways as they migrate to 5G. But before we get into the heavy cryptographic math of how you actually hide a train, we need to talk about the reality of the people running these systems, because you were just telling me about a site visit that kind of...
Oh, man. Yeah, I was just thinking about this site visit from a few years ago.
Yeah.
That perfectly encapsulates the sheer insanity of my industry.
Tell them the story, because it blew my mind.
So look, I'm an OT engineer. I've been doing this for 15 years. And you think you've seen every single way a system can be compromised, right?
Yeah.
But this one, I'm standing in this freezing, dimly lit concrete equipment room.
Like a bunker.
Exactly like a bunker. It's next to a major railway track. It smells like ozone and damp concrete. And I am staring at a supposedly Cecil 4 certified, completely air-gapped, pristine piece of operational technology. This is a vital interlocking system.
And SL4, just so you all listening have the context, that is safety integrity level 4. It's the highest possible risk reduction level in engineering. Like, it means the tolerable hazard rate is less than 1 in 10 billion per hour. It's the absolute gold standard for, this thing cannot fail.
Right. Well, actually, I shouldn't say exactly, because what I saw was the exact opposite of SL4. The local infrastructure manager had sworn up and down, literally signed thick stacks of compliance paperwork, guaranteeing this was a perfectly closed network. No connection to the outside world. A digital
fortress, right.
And then I looked down past the immaculate wiring of the signaling cabinet, and there is this bright blue, frankly filthy Cat5 Ethernet cable. It's snaking out of the bottom of the cabinet, running right across the dusty floor, and plugged directly into a commercial, off-the-shelf Wi-Fi router.
Wait, like a consumer router? Like the kind you or I would go buy at a big box electronics store for $50?
The exact kind. With the 4 little plastic antennas pointing every which way, blinking green LEDs, just completely unsecured.
Oh my God.
So I pulled the maintenance supervisor aside. I am trying so hard to keep my heart rate down. I ask him very calmly what exactly I'm looking at, and he looks at me, completely deadpan, totally unbothered, and says, oh, the night shift guys couldn't get a cellular signal inside the concrete bunker, so they bridged the interlocking network to the outside connection so they could check their emails and stream Sire highlights.
I can't. I mean, you have this multi-million-dollar safety-critical train control system engineered to withstand electromagnetic pulses and physical degradation, and it's completely bypassed by a guy wanting to watch a soccer match on his phone.
Defeated by sheer boredom. It's the quintessential OT security story. As engineers, we spend decades drafting these massive standards to engineer a closed network, and human nature just punches a gaping hole right through it. Which is why the whole concept of a closed network in modern rail is practically a myth at this point.
Right, and if you're reading the EN 50159 standard, which governs safety-related communication and transmission systems, you see this stark divide. Because for decades, the railway industry lived in this fantasy world of the closed transmission system.
Yeah, it was a very comfortable fantasy.
Let's break down that standard for the listener, because understanding the definitions in EN 50159 is critical to understanding the trap the industry is currently in, right? The standard defines a closed network as basically a physical fortress. It means you have a fixed, known number of participants.
You own everything.
Exactly. You control the copper wires, you control the fiber optics, you control the endpoints. And the standard explicitly states that the risk of unauthorized access in a closed network is considered negligible.
Negligible. God, it's such a dangerous word.
Yeah.
Because what it meant historically was that the safety engineers didn't have to factor malicious hackers into their hazard analysis at all. They only had to worry about physics.
Like wear and tear.
Yeah. They worried about copper wire degrading over 30 years, or electromagnetic interference from the high-voltage catenary lines above the train, or, a rat chewing through a cable. In a theoretically true closed network, the only way a threat actor can compromise the system is if they put on a high-visibility vest, take a pair of heavy bolt cutters, physically break through the perimeter fence, pry open the signaling cabinet, and physically splice a rogue device onto the copper wire.
Right, there is no remote masquerade attack happening over the air because there is no air. It's all hardwired.
But as the soccer streaming night shift guys proved, the fortress is an illusion. The second someone plugs in a router, or the second a railway operator decides to route non-critical telemetry data over shared infrastructure to save a few bucks, you cross the threshold. You are no longer in a closed network.
You're in an open network.
Exactly. EN 50159 dictates you are now in an open network, which it treats essentially as a black box. You have an unknown number of participants. The routing path is dynamic and unknown. It is, by definition, a hostile environment.
And the standard doesn't just leave it at open, it actually subdivides the threat landscape. It defines Category 2 open networks, which are technically open but still supposedly have a negligible risk of unauthorized access.
Which is basically a private cloud.
Right. So if you're wondering what that looks like, imagine a private, dedicated fiber optic ring that spans an entire city's transit system. It's open in the sense that different subsystems use it, but it's still strictly owned and logically controlled by the transit authority. But then you have Category 3.
Yeah, Category 3 is the Wild West.
Yeah.
It is an open network with a significant, actively hostile risk of unauthorized access. It is the public internet. It is commercial cellular networks. It is an environment where threat actors are constantly scanning, probing, and attempting to exploit vulnerabilities 24/7.
So if you're listening to this, the obvious logical question is, if Category 3 networks are fundamentally hostile and closed networks are mathematically safer, why on earth is the entire global railway industry actively abandoning the fortress? I mean, why are they sprinting toward Category 3?
Because we have absolutely no choice. I mean, it is a slow-motion infrastructure crisis, and frankly, it is exhausting just trying to keep up with the migration. Look, for the last 20-plus years, trains in Europe communicated using GSMR. The R stands for railway.
Okay.
It was a dedicated, heavily customized, closed, second-generation cellular network. It used specific frequency bands that only the railways were legally allowed to use.
But GSM is ancient. I mean, we are talking about 2G technology in a world that is currently rolling out 6G prototypes.
It's a museum piece. I'm serious. The telecommunications vendors, the companies that actually forge the silicon and build the radio towers, are literally stopping production.
Yeah.
The supply chain for GSMR is completely drying up.
Wow.
You cannot buy spare parts for these trackside radios anymore. Operators are having to cannibalize old equipment just to keep the current network alive. So the entire European single railway area is being forced into a massive pan-European migration to the Future Railway Mobile Communication System, or FRMCS. And FRMCS is not a bespoke rail-only technology. It is built entirely on standard 3GPP 5G architecture.
And that is the terrifying pivot. We are taking the entire legacy infrastructure of European rail, ripping it out by the roots and dropping it onto a 5G service-based architecture.
Okay.
You're moving from a paradigm where the railway owned the physical radio towers, the physical switches, and the copper lines, to a paradigm where you are running safety-critical train control data over shared IP-based open standard networks.
We are taking data that literally stops and starts thousands of tons of steel, moving at 300 kilometers an hour, and running it through the black box of a Category 3 open network. We are trying to run Cell 4 applications over 5G airwaves that anyone with a $200 software-defined radio can tune into.
Right.
It is a monumental, terrifying shift in risk.
Okay, so we are forcing these massive physical kinetic machines onto an invisible, open, hackable 5G network, which naturally begs the question, if anyone can listen to the airwaves, how do you hide a massive high-speed train? I mean, if a state-sponsored threat actor or even just a sophisticated criminal syndicate can see a train communicating on the network, they can target it.
Right, and that was actually the foundational flaw with the old GSMR system. It wasn't built with modern privacy or anti-tracking in mind at all. In GSMR, when a train's radio module booted up and attempted to connect to the trackside cell tower, it had to identify itself.
Obviously.
Yeah, so it broadcasted its MSI, the International Mobile Subscriber Identity, and it broadcasted it in clear text.
Oh, wow. Clear text.
Over the unencrypted air interface. It was just shouting its permanent, unique identifier to the void for anyone to hear.
For anyone listening, let's explain the mechanics of why that clear text transmission is so dangerous. Because it's not just that someone knows a train is there. A threat actor can set up an IMSI catcher, what law enforcement often calls a stingray.
Exactly.
This is a fake cell tower. And because the attacker's stingray is positioned physically closer to the train than the legitimate tower, or because it just broadcasts at a much higher power level, the train's modem is tricked. The
Mhm.
train says, oh, here is a stronger signal from my network, and it drops the real connection to handshake with the rogue stingray. And when it does that, it hands over its MSI.
Right. And once the attacker captures that MSI, the game is heavily skewed because now they can track the exact physical movement of that specific train as it moves from cell sector to cell sector. But tracking is just the reconnaissance phase. The real nightmare is if they use that captured MSI to attempt to spoof that identity back to the actual railway core network.
So to fix this, FRMCS and the new 3GPP standards had to completely kill the IMSI. They had to invent a new way to identify the train without ever exposing its true name.
And that introduces the SUPI and the SUPI. I know, acronym SOUP. But instead of an ENSI, the 5G modem on the train has a subscriber permanent identifier, the SUPI. But the critical mechanical difference here is that the SUPI is never, ever transmitted over the air interface.
Not even encrypted.
Nope. It stays locked in the secure hardware element of the train's radio equipment.
But wait, the network still needs to know who is asking for a connection, right? So if the train can't send its permanent ID, how does it announce itself to the cell tower?
It uses public key cryptography before the session even starts. So the train's onboard equipment has the public key of its home network's user data management system, the UDM, which sits deep inside the telecom core. The train takes its permanent SUPI, encrypts it using that public key, and generates a temporary cryptographically wrapped package called the Subscriber Concealed Identifier, the SUCI. It is the SUCI that actually gets transmitted over the air.
Okay, so if our hypothetical attacker with the stingray forces a connection, they don't get the SUPI, they capture the SUCI, which is just meaningless mathematical noise to them.
Right. They don't have the UDM's private key, so they cannot decrypt it.
It's basically like a witness protection program for high-speed trains. You have this highly valuable asset moving through hostile Category 3 territory, so you never use its real name. You give it a temporary alias. And as the train hurtles down the track, handing off from one 5G base station to the next, the network constantly refreshes that alias. The train keeps changing its disguise, so an attacker passively scanning the radio spectrum just sees a random, disconnected stream of identifiers popping in and out of existence.
You know, I hear that witness protection analogy a lot in telecom security circles, but honestly, in the context of operational technology, it slightly misses the mark.
Wait, really?
How
How
far?
so?
Because in witness protection, the primary goal is privacy. You don't want the mafia to know where the witness lives. But in rail, privacy is kind of a moot point. I mean, we don't really care if a threat actor knows a train is on a track. They could just stand on a physical bridge and look out the window to see the train. The train is huge.
That's a fair point.
Yeah, the cryptographic concealment isn't about hiding the physical asset. It's about preventing active injection attacks. A better analogy is a military unit using rapid frequency hopping radios. They aren't changing frequencies to hide the fact that they exist. The enemy can hear the static.
Right.
They are changing frequencies so the enemy cannot lock on and broadcast fake orders on their channel.
Ah, I see. So if the attacker cannot isolate and lock onto the train's specific authenticated communication session, they cannot format a malicious packet to inject into that session.
Exactly. Let's look at the actual physical consequence of that. The train communicates with a trackside system called a radio block center, or RBC. The RBC is constantly calculating how far the train is allowed to travel before it must stop. This is called the movement authority. If a rogue actor manages to spoof the RBC, they could send a fake movement authority. They could digitally tell the train's braking system, hey, you are clear to accelerate for the next 5 kilometers, when in reality there is a stationary freight train occupying that exact block just around the bend. By constantly rotating the SCCI and enforcing strict session parameters, we ensure the attacker can't inject that fake command. It's all rigorously documented in the 3GPP specification. TS 33.501, I think.
Yeah, TS 33.501.
Right. It is literally hundreds of pages of mathematical pain just to ensure the train is who it says it is and the network is who it says it is without exposing the core identifiers.
Okay, but let me challenge you on that, because hiding the identity with the SCCI is really only step one, right? Just because I hand a bouncer an encrypted ID card that he can read doesn't mean I am allowed into the club. And more importantly, as the patron, how do I know the bouncer isn't just some guy in a suit who set up a fake velvet rope on the sidewalk? The train has to prove it belongs to the network. But the network also has to prove it is the legitimate railway infrastructure and not a sophisticated stingray.
And that is the exact vulnerability that 5G aka solves. 5G authentication and key agreement. It is the absolute bedrock of this entire open network gamble. It is a system of mutual authentication. See, in the 2G and 3G days, the network rarely had to prove who it was to the device. The device just blindly trusted the strongest tower signal.
Which is exactly why MSI catchers worked so well.
Precisely. But in FRMCS, when the train's radio attempts to connect, it essentially challenges the network. It demands cryptographic proof that the 5G tower is connected to the legitimate railway core. And simultaneously, the core network's authentication server function, the AUSF, verifies the train's credentials. They undergo this complex, multi-step challenge and response process at the speed of light.
And if that mutual authentication succeeds, if both sides mathematically prove they are legitimate, they don't just open a clear text pipe, they actually use that authentication moment to generate a massive hierarchy of cryptographic keys.
It cascades like a waterfall. It all starts with the primary master key, called the case-off. Both the train and the core network independently derive this exact same master key using the authentication vectors they just exchanged. And because they derive it independently based on shared secrets, the key itself never has to be transmitted over the air. From that master case-off, they derive specific keys for the signaling plane, which controls the connection, and the user plane, which carries the actual train control data.
And if you look at the FRMCS specification, they do not mess around with the encryption standards for that user plane data. For media payloads, and specifically for critical train control data like European train control system messages, the standard mandates incredibly robust algorithms. We are talking about AE days 128 GCM.
Authenticated encryption with associated data, using the advanced encryption standard with a 128-bit key, operating in Galois counter mode. Try saying that 5 times fast.
I definitely will not. But for the listener who isn't a cryptographer, let's break down why that specific alphabet soup of an algorithm is so crucial, specifically the GCM part, the Galois counter mode. Because that choice isn't just about security, is it? It's about physical OT performance.
It's entirely about latency. Older encryption modes, like cipher block chaining or CBC, are serial processes. Imagine you have a message broken into 100 blocks of data. In CBC, you cannot decrypt block number 2 until you have successfully decrypted block number 1.
Right, they're chained together.
Exactly. The output of the first feeds into the second. If you have 100 train cars, it's like a single inspector checking the brakes on car 1, finishing, walking to car 2, finishing, and so on. It takes time.
And when a train is hurtling toward a switch point at 300 kilometers an hour, time is the one thing you absolutely do not have. You cannot wait for a serial chain to finish processing.
You absolutely cannot. You need to decrypt and mathematically verify the integrity of that movement authority in a fraction of a millisecond. If the data is delayed, the train safety computer assumes it has gone blind and triggers the emergency brakes. Galois counter mode solves this by allowing parallel processing. It essentially assigns 100 inspectors to check all 100 train cars simultaneously. It uses Galois field mathematics to authenticate the data, providing both confidentiality, meaning no one can read it, and integrity, meaning no one altered it in transit, in one highly efficient, parallelized pass.
It sounds incredibly elegant. I mean, you have this seamless, mathematically rigorous, dynamically rotating key architecture happening continuously in the background at the speed of light over a 5G airwave.
It does sound elegant. And, if the railway was built from scratch yesterday, it would be. But you are completely forgetting the reality of the legacy equipment that actually drives the train. The 5G radio layer is doing its beautiful AES GCM dance, but the actual train control application sitting above it, the European Train Control System, or ETCS, is relying on a completely different ancient set of symmetric keys to authenticate the application layer messages. And for a massive part of the European rail network, those ETCS keys are managed offline.
Wait, what do you mean offline? Like, they aren't connected to a central server?
I mean literally disconnected from any network. I mean a human being in a high-visibility jacket carrying a physical object.
You're kidding.
I wish I was. This is the stuff that gives me night terrors. To secure the application connection between the train's onboard computer and the trackside radio block center, you need a shared symmetric transport key and a message authentication code, or MAC. And under the legacy specifications, you physically have to use hardware storage devices to move these keys around.
Are you seriously telling me that to secure a multi-billion-dollar digital automated 5G railway, Someone is walking around the train yard with a USB stick?
A USB stick, a smart card, a specialized serial dongle.
Yes.
You generate the cryptographic keys at a secure key management center. You load them onto this physical dongle. A technician signs out that dongle, walks out into the rail yard, usually at 3 a.m. in the pouring rain, climbs up the metal ladder into the locomotive cab, plugs the dongle into a serial port on the European Vital computer, and manually punches in a code to trigger a software update to install the keys.
Oh my God.
And you don't just do this for the train. Another technician has to drive a truck out to the remote trackside signaling cabins to do the exact same thing to the physical equipment out there.
That is the most absurd clash of centuries I think I have ever heard of. You have a 5G network utilizing cloud-native core functions and Galois field mathematics, and it's being secured by a guy physically carrying a floppy disk down the tracks.
It is brutal.
Mm-hmm.
And think about the operational nightmare. What if a key is compromised? What if an employee just loses a smart card in the snow? Or what if your corporate security policy just dictates that keys must be rotated every 90 days? You have to dispatch fleets of technicians across an entire country to physically touch every single train, every single trackside cabinet, just to rotate a string of numbers. It is the ultimate friction between old-school physical rail operations and modern cryptography.
Well, obviously the industry can't sustain that. I mean, it doesn't scale at all.
They can't, which is exactly why there's a massive push to migrate toward online key management systems. The newer specifications, like subset 038, finally outline how to distribute these transport keys over the air securely. But you still have this massive, entrenched, installed base of legacy equipment that expects physical intervention. You have thousands of silos of 20-year-old hardware.
Which perfectly sets up the ultimate buzzword collision in this space.
Yeah.
Because if you look at any of the strategic roadmaps for FRMCS, specifically those white papers coming out of the Datacom Industry Association, they all hammer on the exact same phrase. The railway must adopt a zero-trust architecture. They look at the 5G service-based architecture, they look at enterprise IT, and they basically say, hey, look, cloud networks use zero-trust, so we just need to copy-paste that model onto the trains.
And that phrase right there, copy-paste IT security onto OT, that is exactly what makes engineers like me want to tear our hair out. It is a fundamental, physically dangerous misunderstanding of what operational technology actually is. You cannot just drop an enterprise IT zero-trust model onto a railway control loop. It is a completely hostile environment for that kind of architecture.
But wait, let's look at the core principle of zero-trust. The mantra is never trust, always verify. You assume the network perimeter is already breached. You don't trust a device just because it's on the internal network. You authenticate every single packet. You microsegment every device with dynamic firewalls. You continuously evaluate access policies. On paper, for a Category 3 open network running over public airways, that sounds exactly like what you need.
On paper, yes. In a corporate office where the worst-case scenario is an email takes 2 seconds longer to send, zero trust is brilliant. But let's look at the physical reality of traditional OT networks. They are built on deterministic control loops.
Okay, define deterministic in this specific context.
Deterministic means the system is designed to do the exact same thing in the exact same amount of time every single time with absolute zero deviation. It is predictable down to the microsecond. A track circuit pings a relay, the relay processes the signal, and it responds. It operates on strict millisecond timing budgets. The safety architecture depends entirely on that predictability. If you inject a dynamic, identity-centric access control policy engine like a zero-trust firewall into the middle of that control loop, you introduce jitter. You introduce variable latency.
So let's trace the physical chain reaction of that latency. Say you have a microsegmentation firewall sitting between the trackside equipment and the train, and it decides it needs to reevaluate an authorization token. It holds a critical telemetry packet for, say, 50 milliseconds while it checks a database. What actually happens?
Okay, so if the safety watchdog timer in the train's European Vital computer expects a heartbeat message every 20 milliseconds, and the firewall delays it by 50, the computer doesn't think, oh, the network is congested or running a security check.
It panics.
Exactly. It thinks, I have lost communication with the track. I am blind. The fail-safe protocol instantly triggers. The software commands the electro-pneumatic valves to open. The brake pipe, which runs the entire length of the train, vents its compressed air to the atmosphere. That sudden drop in air pressure mechanically forces the brake cylinders to shove composite brake pads directly onto the spinning steel wheels. You have just slammed the emergency brakes on a mainline train carrying hundreds of passengers at 300 kilometers an hour, potentially causing injuries and definitely causing a massive network-wide cascading delay. And all because your zero trust firewall decided to think for a fraction of a second too long.
Wow. So a digital policy update causes a kinetic physical emergency stock. That is the fundamental difference between IT and OT. In IT, a delayed packet is an annoyance. In OT, a delayed packet is a literal safety hazard.
Exactly. And it's not just the real-time performance constraint. It is the sheer computing power of the life cycles. We are talking about interlockings and trackside signaling controllers that have a 20 to 30-year operational life cycle. I still work on equipment installed in 2004. These physical boxes have microprocessors with the computing power of a digital wristwatch. They do not have the CPU overhead or the memory to perform continuous cryptographic verification of every single transaction. They rely on proprietary legacy protocols that don't even have data fields in their headers for authentication tokens.
So how is the industry supposed to bridge this gap? Because the new standards, like IEC 63452, clearly demand a cultural shift. They mandate moving away from the old physical perimeter model. Historically, as you said, the OT security boundary was a physical chain link fence and a heavy padlock on a metal cabinet. But now the standard says the boundary has to be logical, it has to be software defined.
It is an agonizing, incredibly expensive retrofit process. Because we can't rip out billions of dollars of legacy trackside equipment, the standard forces us to build gateway systems. We have to create these complex translation layers.
So the gateway sits in the middle.
Right. It sits exactly between the highly secure, identity-centric 5G FRMCS world and the dumb, highly deterministic legacy OT world. The gateway has to handle all the heavy cryptographic lifting. It performs a protocol validation, the continuous zero trust authorization, the decryption, and then it passes a clean, simple, unencrypted analog or serial signal down to the legacy equipment. And it has to maintain strict isolation so the legacy box is never exposed to the jitter of the 5G network.
But introducing a new piece of hardware into a SIL 4 environment means...
I mean, certification hell.
Yeah, I figured.
Every single one of those translation gateways has to go through rigorous safety certification. If you update the firmware on the gateway or you change one single line of code in the zero trust authorization policy, you might have to legally recertify the entire SIL 4 system just to prove you haven't introduced a new hazard. It is a regulatory and technical nightmare that is bottlenecking the entire industry right now.
Which actually brings us to the grand finale of this whole nightmare. Because everything we've talked about so far, the CCI encryption, the 5G AKA handshakes, the offline key management with the USB sticks, the translation gateways, that is just the complexity of securing a single train moving within a single country's borders. But Europe isn't isolated. What happens when that heavily secured, deeply authenticated train is moving at high speed and crosses a national border? What happens when an SNCF train leaves France and enters Germany?
Cross-border interoperability.
Yeah.
The ultimate dream of the single European railway area and the absolute bane of my existence.
I can hear the exhaustion in your voice.
Look, from a purely radio perspective, the 3GPP 5G standards handle roaming perfectly well. We've been roaming on our cell phones for decades. The architecture uses a node called the Security Edge Protection Proxy, the SEPP.
And for the listener, the SEPP is basically the border guard of the telecom network. It sits at the absolute edge of a mobile operator's core network. It validates, encrypts, and applies policy enforcement to all the signaling traffic traveling between different operators. It is the bouncer standing between the French 5G core and the German 5G core.
Yes, but the SEPP model was inherited directly from the consumer telecom industry, and it is designed for bilateral roaming agreements between massive mobile network operators. It is a static, heavily negotiated relationship. Vodafone and Deutsche Telekom sign a contract, they predefine their peering relationships, and the SEP enforces it. But for true pan-European railway operations, that model completely falls apart.
Because of the scale.
Because of the fragmentation. You don't just have 2 or 3 telecom operators. You have dozens of national railway infrastructure managers. You have hundreds of independent train operating companies, both passenger and freight. You have thousands of equipment suppliers. Trying to manage static bilateral SEPP agreements between all those entities is completely unscalable. You need a system that allows for dynamic interdomain trust on the fly.
And this is where the proposed Railway Trust Framework, the RTF, comes in. I was reading the DIA white paper on this, and it is a massive structural shift in how trust is brokered across borders. They draw a direct analogy to the Federated Public Key Infrastructure, the PKI, that the automotive sector uses for connected cars.
Oh, I know the paper you're talking about. Explain how they envision the RTF actually working, because I have very strong, very tired opinions on this.
Okay, so the RTF proposes building a massive cryptographic hierarchy. At the very apex, you establish a Root Trust Authority, an RTA. This would be a pan-European governing body that defines the overarching certificate policy, manages the top-level cryptographic standards, and oversees the audit procedures for the entire continent. Then, beneath that single root, every national infrastructure manager like DB in Germany or SNCF in France acts as a subordinate certification authority, a CA. They are cross-certified with the RTA.
And then those national CAs are the ones actually issuing the digital certificates to the equipment, right?
Exactly. The national CA issues limited lifetime certificates to the onboard units of the trains and the trackside gateways. And the brilliant part of the proposal is where the access decisions are enforced. They don't want to backhaul every single authentication request to a central server in Brussels. They want to enforce access at the edge.
Using the existing 5G control functions.
Yes. The SCP, the Access and Mobility Management Function, the Session Management Function, they act as the policy enforcement points. When a French train crosses into Germany, the German edge nodes validate the certificate attributes. They ask, what domain are you from? What is your assurance level? And to solve that deterministic latency problem you were ranting about earlier, the framework proposes using edge computing nodes in the visited network to physically cache the validated certificates.
So the German cell tower already has the French train's verified credentials stored locally before the train even arrives.
Right. So when the train actually crosses the physical border at 250 kilometers an hour, it performs a local verification. It re-authenticates in milliseconds without having to query a central server back in Paris over a congested backbone. From a technical perspective, it is a brilliant, elegant solution for low latency, cross-border zero trust.
Okay, let me stop you right there. Is it technically brilliant? Sure. If you draw it out on a whiteboard in an engineering laboratory, the math is beautiful. But politically, culturally, it is an absolute pipe dream. It is completely functionally impossible in the real world.
Why? I mean, the European Union mandates interoperability. The regulatory frameworks are already pushing heavily toward this. Look at the EU Cyber Resilience Act. It's demanding unified security baselines.
Regulation from Brussels does not magically dissolve hundreds of years of national sovereignty over critical infrastructure. You are talking about establishing a single root trust authority for the entire European railway network. Do you fully understand what that implies? It means getting the French Transport Ministry, the German Federal Railway Authority, the Italians, the Swiss, the Spanish, to all sit in a room and agree on exactly who holds the master cryptographic keys to their national transport grids.
But they already cooperate on physical rail standards.
Physical standards are different from surrendering digital sovereignty. Who actually runs the RTA? Where are the servers physically located? Are they in a data center in Frankfurt or Paris? Who conducts the security audits? If a foreign intelligence agency breaches the route, they could theoretically issue fraudulent certificates that compromise the signaling systems of every single country in the bloc.
So you build a consortium. You establish a neutral supranational entity under the European Union Agency for Railways. You use multi-party computation so no single nation holds the entire key.
And what happens when a state-sponsored threat actor breaches a subordinate CA in one specific country? Say a smaller national operator gets hacked. Because they all share a federated trust model under the RTF, that compromise suddenly threatens to cascade across borders. The German infrastructure manager now has to decide whether to trust a certificate issued by a compromised foreign CA. Who holds the liability if a spoofed message causes a derailment in a visited network? You are asking deeply entrenched, historically isolationist national railway monopolies to surrender ultimate cryptographic authority to a centralized body. The technical architecture for the RTF is flawless. The governance model is science fiction. It will take 30 years of committees just to agree on the font size of the certificate policies, let alone the cryptographic root of trust.
You're being overly cynical. The automotive industry managed to solve this exact problem. They successfully rolled out federated PKI for vehicle-to-everything communication, V2X. You have millions of cars from dozens of different rival manufacturers crossing international borders every single day, securely authenticating with each other and with smart city infrastructure. If highly competitive car manufacturers can figure out a shared trust model, state-backed railways can figure it out.
Cars are not state-owned critical infrastructure, carrying hazardous kinetic materials and thousands of commuters on fixed steel guideways. If a car's V2X digital certificate fails to authenticate, what happens? The driver looks out the windshield with their human eyes and hits the physical brake pedal. It's an inconvenience. If a high-speed train's RTS certificate fails during a border handover at 250 kilometers an hour, the ETCS computer drops a connection. The failsafe triggers, the emergency brakes deploy, and you have just shut down a primary trans-European transport corridor, trapping thousands of people. The stakes are entirely different. The political friction, the liability, the national security implications, they are entirely different.
But the alternative is maintaining the current fragmented silos. You simply cannot run a 21st century low-latency 5G FRMCS network while relying on 19th century physical national borders and bilateral paperwork. You have to force the federation. You have to force the shared trust model, or the whole digital rail project collapses under its own technological weight.
Forcing the federation before the governance is ready is exactly how you end up with a compromised root trust.
That's all for this episode of Cybersecurity Under Pressure. Real attacks, real lessons. If you take one thing away from this deep dive, let it be this. We spend so much time worrying about the brilliance of the math, the encryption algorithms, the zero trust models, but at the end of the day, security always violently collides with the physical world, whether that's a failing brake pipe, a bored night shift worker with a router, or politicians arguing over who holds the keys. See you in the next chapter.